Welcome all. Bob Woodward, you just heard Senator Feingold, the Democrats now suggesting in his mind censuring the president for his conduct of the war in Iraq.
Yeah, I don't know where that goes. Clearly, the Democrats are frustrated. One of the things you learn when you try to understand presidents, in the end, they work their will, particularly on issues of war, and they can't, find a hook to get into this to stop it or change it.
David Brooks, you spent an hour and 10 minutes with the president and with some other conservative columnist reporters. You wrote this: I left the 110-minute session with President Bush thinking that far from being worn down by the past few years, Bush seemed empowered. His self-confidence is the most remarkable feature of his presidency. No second-guessing about the war in Iraq?
Not really, no. I mean, on the little things, it's interesting. On the big things, I don't think there has been second-guessing. Bob would call it a state of denial. And I think on the big things, on whether he thinks theologically all human beings have a gift of wanting to desire freedom and all countries should be democratic, he hasn't budged an inch on that. And the second thing which impressed me about that meeting, his faith in his own power, the power of the presidency to change the world. He has not budged on that. And so you might think that's strong leadership. You might think he's deranged. But his basic attitude, I think, has not changed. What has changed, I think, is a little more honesty and tactical flexibility now that Donald Rumsfeld is gone. I think they've hired people like Mike McConnell who are much more honest and who are much more willing to look realistically at the situation. But on the basics, no change.
But when the president sees or hears what I just read from Steve Hayes' book about McConnell speaking candidly about his perception as a citizen, as what he saw the administration do in terms of molding or shaping intelligence, what would the president say about that?
Yeah, I would still think he thinks the fundamentals are true, that in the long run, he'll be proved right. And that's kind of remarkable. I think a lot of us who supported the war, the failures of the war have set off a whole cascade of philosophical thinking. Maybe in the Arab world, they're not culturally ready for democracy. Maybe we don't have the power to do it. We just don't have the competencies of government. It's created a whole set of serious debates. It doesn't seem to have created that in the president's mind.
And now a Democratic senator is going to introduce a resolution to censure him for his conduct of the war.
I think a big tactical mistake from a Democratic perspective. There are 30 Republican senators who are desperate to get away from President Bush. They've been pushed back toward President Bush by, one, Harry Reid making this more partisan, and a censure resolution would make it hyper-partisan. So I think it would be huge for the whole political landscape if those Republicans drifted away from Bush. But it's not going to happen if there's censure resolutions, if it's a partisan debate.
Steve Hayes, in your new book, Cheney, The Untold Story of America's Most Powerful and Controversial Vice President, you write this: some people think if we just walk away from Iraq, everything will be fine. That's the optional war, that you don't have to be there, that it's possible to retreat behind our oceans and be safe and secure. Withdrawal from Iraq doesn't damage our interests in this wider conflict, and that may be in part because they don't believe there's a wider conflict. I know different. It's so clear to me. I have trouble understanding why it's unclear to everybody else. That same certitude that David Brooks used to describe the president, you're using to describe the vice president.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think one of the things we saw this week, and this speaks directly to what the vice president told me, is with the release of this NIE, we saw a shift in thinking. I think for a long time, administration critics had begun to make the argument that really this al-Qaeda threat is overblown, that they misled us into the war in Iraq, they're misleading us about the seriousness of the threat from al-Qaeda. And I think what the NIE does, even though in some ways it's very critical of the administration, is it strengthens the basic case that the administration has been making, that al-Qaeda remains a serious threat.
But it seems to contradict last year's intelligence estimate.
No question.
That al-Qaeda's ability had been diminished.
No question. I think what Admiral McConnell said about that was exactly right, and it's what you hear, I think, if you talk to sort of on-the-ground intelligence officials over there, that this March 2006 truce between Pervez Musharraf and the Islamists was catastrophic.
In your book, you asked the vice president about the insurgency being in the last throes when he was interviewed about it. He now acknowledges to you that was a mistake.
Yeah, he said it was obviously wrong for him to have said that. And what he said was he had been reading reports that Zarqawi was on the run, that they were getting close to getting him, and that at this point it looked like that was going to be sort of a marker. And one of the things he said to me as I conducted these interviews was that he thought that there would be these markers, and these markers, the capture of Saddam Hussein, the elections, Zarqawi's death, would contribute to sort of a turnaround. And they didn't, and he said that comment was obviously wrong.
And no doubts about the war in Iraq, no second guessing.
Zero. I think what he says is what we've got to do is a better job communicating that this war in Iraq is a central part of the broader war.